So this week, we're going to explore story and the privileged position that it has within our minds. Now, a lot of pressure because I'm used to, at the moment, coasting and letting you guys do all the answering. But I'm going to hand over to you, Neil. I'm going to try and field some of this because I've done quite a bit of reading about story. Whether or not that's a consensus view, as always, that's the risk you take when you ask me a question, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, there's no pressure, Kieran, but I think one of our early interactions was when you and Lloyd were working on the story project together. So I think it makes sense that you're in a bit of the hot seat. So I think the last kind of 3 or 4 years, we've kind of all heard that, stories are psychologically privileged. Dan Williams says that, they're particularly sticky. David Didow says that they hold a privileged position. But what does that actually mean when we say that and when we hear that about story?
I mean, right off the bat, I think we're not necessarily talking about full blown stories in every instance, full blown like start to finish narratives. But I think what we're talking about is the idea that humans seem to remember information that's presented within a narrative structure more readily than they will isolated facts, which I think makes sense because all the stuff we know about schema development, the idea that we take the very edge of our understanding and we push a little bit further, we connect things that we know. I think when we say a story is particularly sticky, it's the idea that when we present information in that way, there's a higher likelihood that we're going to make both sense of it and also retain it for a little bit longer. Now, because I'm thinking about things like, I mean, me and Lloyd did a lot of reading on evolutionary biology, and I don't know if we went too far down the rabbit hole because a lot of this stuff, I think, if you look at the cognitive psychology and the sort of research into education and learning in general, I think you probably get to the position where you could probably make inferences about this stuff. But we looked right back at there's a book called Language and Species from about 1992, and it was essentially looking for archaeological evidence of the development of the human mind and the development of language in particular. And there's one school of thought that the cognitive architecture for the retrieval of information and the production of language developed around the same time. Now, obviously, we have no way of proving this conclusively, so there will be various schools of thought. But the one that was most convincing to me and Lloyd was this one that said that this almost cataclysmic event where we went from hominids with the capacity to communicate and to carry out vaguely sophisticated activities towards the point that allowed us to travel to where we are now. I think this cataclysmic event in the development of humans happened around the same time, and so I always talk about how the distinguishing feature between the great apes and humans is that the great apes don't have the power to voluntarily retrieve information, so they can be trained with thousands and thousands of hours of training to respond to cues. But a gorilla, for instance, couldn't actively retrieve information from its long-term memory. And so the ability to do that and the ability to generate sounds that were communicable developed at the same time. And so it's the idea, we think about reading not being biologically primary, but speaking being biologically primary. Both those systems have had roughly the same amount of time to develop. And so they are almost a part of us and our architecture, and they have developed in tandem with each other. And so if we're thinking about the sort of, the best model we have at the moment is the model of long-term memory. Whatever's happening there under the hood is happening with our ability to communicate with each other and to describe the world in which we exist. Because no two people see the same thing when they look at the world. And the example I give is about eyewitness testimony not being reliable because your brain can convince you that you've seen things that you haven't. And so really what we're doing is we're interpreting what our eyes see, and our brain is making a sort of manageable picture for us. And so everything could be described perhaps as a story in or as a representation in some respect. But we're just, I think, quite highly tuned to this process. And so when we get information delivered in this way, we can we can remember more easily and make sense of it more readily.
Fascinating stuff. I mean, immediately what you said there about this idea of a cataclysmic change or cataclysmic event and these two coinciding ideas, or two should I say coinciding developments, made me think. And again, I don't think this is a new observation, but presumably there's something almost inherently baked into language about story. I mean, subject and verb is story. You know, someone or something did something or something happened to them. The definition of, you know, what, like the building blocks of sentences are clauses, and clauses are there is a thing and something happened to it. And that is at its very core, presumably, a big part of what makes story, an action happening to a thing or a person about which we have some form of investment, or that we're supposed to care about. Along those lines, in briefly preparing for this podcast, I typed into Google, as you do, well, what is a story? And I was a big fan of what Ursula K. Le Guin said, which was, what makes a story is you want to find out what happens next. And she put it down as simply as that. I know that there are much more complicated definitions, and there's no probably one correct way of thinking about story. But thinking about what you want to achieve as a teacher and the value of attention, that seems like a pretty valuable thing to aim for.
In that language and species, he spends a whole chapter looking right down to the level of the predicate, and is essentially showing you the relationship between our development and the structure of our language and things together, and how things have developed over time. You know, in fact, that's, you know, if I ever read that again, that'll probably be a chapter I go back to, because you know, just you saying that, Chris, it actually makes more sense hearing your take and then thinking, oh yeah, I've read that. But whenever Lloyd and I talked about this, we didn't really necessarily go into the literacy aspect as much, probably because the evolutionary biology was enough to get our heads around, because it was a massive overload for quite a long time when we were doing that stuff.
Obviously, that's all really kind of fascinating stuff. And I like, as Chris said, what stood out for me was that that moment of, you know, communication, and you say that ability to retrieve information, and obviously, you know, story being the conduit of which is communicate and provides that schematic structure to retrieve that information. Now, obviously, we know that there was a massive lag between spoken language and the written form. So I'm just wondering if you think that hypothetically, if the written form came around at the same time as language, do you think stories would not hold that privilege that they now have, because we could rely on a literal written cue for that, rather than having to, you know, internalize these structures as stories?
So, like the brain outsourcing its resources to something different.
So realize I don't need to remember this because we have this thing, and it's you know, I can just read it.
I mean, I think there are two answers. The first one is the short one is that seems to be the way the brain is designed. You know, if we can outsource stuff, then we'll take the path of least resistance, you know, which is why habit formation is so difficult, and why it's so difficult to actually exercise and eat healthily, because it takes a lot of work. And, you know, like Peps always says, we're going to go for that biscuit every time, aren't we? So I think if had it existed, we probably would have done that. It feels like it. But it feels like, you know, in terms of the long answer, a lot of the things that we have, and a lot of the sort of the phenomena that we experience as humans, has been the result of our brain's way of helping us cope with our own consciousness. Because I think consciousness is a pretty big deal. And, you know, we have things like cognitive biases, which almost protect us and have protected us at some point in our evolution. Sometimes we get hangovers from those, you know, things that aren't necessarily necessary anymore. So I think, a young brain being given this crutch may not have needed to develop protection from certain aspects. Obviously, I don't understand to the full extent, but I do feel like a lot of the psychological phenomena we experience are the result of us trying to protect ourselves from ourselves, without getting too philosophical about the whole thing. So, long story short, I reckon we would outsource where necessary.
I'd add there, and this is complete speculation, but it seems that if a lot of early stories from the early evidence of the oral tradition is about it or involves explanation of the natural world. And often this ends up, for whatever reason, being anthropomorphic, and so which inherently brings about this sense of story. I mean, which came first? This idea that we are prone to telling stories, and thus we anthropomorphize the world in order to explain natural phenomenon, or the anthropomorphizing came first and thus stories came about. I don't know, but again, purely speculation. But I think the link between those two things is probably important in the development of story, and the prominent position that it has within all cultures.
Yeah, I mean, if you read things like the Volsung saga, I mean, I've totally butchered that name, but essentially it's one of the few remaining recorded versions of the Viking sagas, and the Volsung one's an Icelandic one that sort of tells the story of Ragnar and Sigurd and the dragon and things like that there. And it seems like civilizations will have forgotten where these stories came from because they happened so long ago, and the snake that wraps itself around the world may have been a very different story in when it was originally told. It may have been a story to protect yourself from animals such as that. And if you think about the sheer distance in time that ancient Egypt spanned, the stories that they were telling about their gods, it's they probably evolved from warning stories, initially that helped you deal with the literal world, to the point in which they sort of got.
Always find it fascinating whenever you're teaching, history, and you're looking at the ancient civilizations. You're doing, not even ancient civilizations, kind of any civilization, and you're doing some of the myths, and the similarities are, stark. I don't think I've ever come across a child that hasn't appreciated that these myths are effectively the same, just with different characters. So really kind of interesting stuff.